In a quiet Montana town, morning light touched an old schoolyard where laughter usually echoed. But on this day, something staggering from the pines would shatter every sense of normal. A massive grizzly, torn and bleeding, limped past the rusted swings and collapsed on the gravel, its dark eyes filled with a pain that spoke louder than any roar. What followed forced strangers to choose between fear and mercy, and the ending would leave an entire town changed forever. Before we begin, leave a like on this video and share in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Morning in Pine Hollow never felt rushed. It was the kind of rural Montana town where the air always smelled faintly of pine resin and damp earth, where people still waved from pickup trucks and the sound of the river carried over the rooftops. But that morning, something was off. Helen Kerrigan noticed it first. She was sweeping leaves from the old chain-link fence that lined the schoolyard, her breath misting in the cold air. Helen wasn't one to spook easily. She'd spent years living alone after losing her husband in a logging accident. But the stillness pressing in from the tree line made her pause mid-sweep. She looked up and caught sight of the hills, their crowns dipped in fog. Normally, birds would be stirring, flitting between branches, but not today. Not a single chirp, not a single rustle of squirrels. She shifted the rake in her hands and let out a quiet laugh to herself, trying to shake it off. Maybe she was imagining things. Pine Hollow didn't do mysteries. It did routine, and the old brick school behind her was as much a part of that as the morning bells and the smell of chalk dust. Inside, Principal Martin Yates was going over attendance logs, a man carved out of routine himself. 52 years old, hair graying at the temples, a face lined with the kind of worries only small-town schools could give you. He poured his second cup of coffee, staring out at the empty playground. Helen was out there as always, moving like she had all the time in the world. What he didn't see, what no one saw, was the movement in the shadow of the pines, a shape too big to be anything ordinary. The staff room door opened and closed, boots clattering on the floor as a science teacher joked about the temperature dropping overnight. Helen barely heard them through the cracked window. That uneasy silence had wrapped around her like a shroud now. She set the rake down and squinted, trying to pierce the gray-green blur of trees. Something shifted again, heavy enough to make the underbrush ripple. Her heart thudded. Out here, you learn to tell the difference between a deer and something else. This was something else. Helen took a slow step back, breath-catching. The weight in the air was almost electric, like the seconds before a storm splits open the sky. She thought of her husband for no reason she could explain. His voice, low and steady, telling her that the wild always keeps its secrets until it decides otherwise. Martin moved from the window, picking up the loudspeaker mic, ready to announce the start of the day. But a deep, ragged sound carried across the yard and hit Helen like a punch to the chest. A growl, but not like any she'd heard. It was broken, strained, almost pleading. The leaves in the trees trembled as something massive edged closer. Helen's mouth went dry. Every instinct told her to run, but something else rooted her feet to the ground. She could feel eyes on her from the shadows. She knew, in that breathless instant, that Pine Hollow's quiet morning was about to become something no one would ever forget. And then, from between the pines, something moved, broad shoulders swaying, fur streaked with something dark and wet. Helen's pulse roared in her ears as the shape stepped forward, and the world seemed to hold itself still, waiting to see what would happen next. Helen's rake slipped from her hand and clanged against the gravel, the metallic echo cutting through the frozen air. What emerged from the tree line was no ordinary wanderer of the wild. It was a grizzly, and not just any grizzly. This one was a wreck of fur and blood and sheer stubborn life. Its left flank was torn open, a wound so deep Helen felt her stomach twist. Pine needles clung to its coat, its massive shoulders rolled with each shuddering breath, and its eyes, those eyes, looked like they carried every storm the wilderness had ever known. Inside, Martin caught movement out of the corner of his eye and leaned toward the window, coffee forgotten. His throat went dry at the sight. He'd seen bears before in these hills, usually in the distance, lumbering through berry patches or crossing a service road. But never like this. Never one limping into a schoolyard at daybreak. He muttered something that didn't sound like words and pushed away from his desk. Helen took 2 steps back, heartbeat sprinting. But the bear didn't charge. It didn't even look aggressive. It moved with a kind of broken grace, like every step might be its last. It stumbled past the swing set, the chains clinking softly as if sensing the weight of this moment. For a fleeting second, Helen thought about how absurd this was. Her, a middle-aged groundskeeper, face to face with a creature that could crush her in an instant. Yet there was no urge to scream, just a strange ache, like she was witnessing something sacred and tragic all at once. A teacher opening the back door saw it next and froze, tray of papers tilting. Within seconds, whispers spread through the halls. Someone hissed for everyone to stay inside, to lock doors. Someone else asked if it was rabid. Fear sprouted like weeds, quick and invasive. But Helen couldn't move. She watched the bear lower its head and release a sound that made her knees weaken. Not a roar, a deep, guttural groan that spoke of pain, of desperation, of a world out there that had given it nothing but scars. Martin was already in the hallway, telling staff to stay calm, but his hands trembled as he spoke. He stepped outside, keeping distance, eyes darting from Helen to the bear. The morning light caught the creature's face then, and Martin saw what Helen had seen. The exhaustion, the quiet plea hidden behind the wild. And then it happened. A crack thundered from the hills, sharp and distant, like a rifle shot echoing through the trees. The grizzly flinched violently, swinging its massive head toward the sound, and let out a roar so raw it rattled the windows behind Helen. Gravel vibrated under her feet. Martin grabbed her arm, pulling her back instinctively, but Helen barely felt it. Her gaze stayed locked on the bear as its eyes darted across the yard, searching for threats no one could see. That single gunshot wasn't just noise. It was a clue, a promise, and a warning all tangled into one. Somewhere out there, someone was still after this bear. Helen felt her breath catch as the realization sank in. This wasn't just a wounded animal stumbling by chance. It was running from something brutal, from someone relentless, and it had chosen this place of all places to fall apart. The bell hadn't even rung, but every soul in Pine Hollow School was now holding its breath, waiting to see if this yard would become a sanctuary or a battlefield. And Helen, heart racing and eyes burning, knew that whatever came next would change everything. Sirens in the distance started low, like a warning hum beneath the crisp air, growing louder by the second. Helen's boots scraped the gravel as she instinctively took a step forward toward the wounded giant, even as Martin's grip on her arm tightened. He was trying to hold her back, his voice trembling with authority he suddenly wasn't sure he still owned. This wasn't in the handbook. This wasn't a drill. The bear swayed where it stood, one paw digging at the earth in a slow, absent rhythm. Dust rose in soft puffs, catching the morning light. Helen couldn't stop staring at those eyes. They weren't the eyes of a wild killer. They were hollow, dimmed by exhaustion, by pain layered on pain. And that realization burned through every instinct to run. She heard herself whisper something. Words meant more for the bear than for anyone else. Soft, shaky, almost a promise that she wasn't here to hurt it. Inside the school, tension was building like a live wire. A teacher in the hall hissed at Martin to pull her inside before she got herself killed. Another whispered prayers under her breath. It was chaos wrapped in silence, every heartbeat waiting for what the sheriff would do. And then Damon Rourke's cruiser roared into the yard, tires spitting gravel. He swung out, face grim, rifle in hand. This was a man carved by decades of hard choices in a county where predators and people shared the same thin line. His voice was steady, but the words were edged with urgency. Everyone stay back. Helen, move away now. He raised the tranquilizer rifle, squinting through the sight. Helen didn't move. Her pulse hammered in her neck, but she couldn't move, because in that moment, she wasn't looking at a threat. She was looking at something that had been hunted, starved, broken, and still somehow alive. And the idea of it being put down like a dangerous beast twisted her gut in a way she hadn't felt since the day they lowered her husband into the earth. Martin, torn between the safety of his staff and the raw humanity playing out before him, stepped to Damon's side. His voice cracked, pleading, saying there had to be another way. Damon didn't answer. His finger rested on the trigger, his training louder than any argument. The bear lifted its head slowly, a thin thread of saliva stretching from its jaw. It took one shaky step forward, and gravel shifted beneath its weight. Helen's knees weakened, but she stood her ground, holding her hands slightly out, not in defense, but as if she could somehow bridge that distance between their worlds. The staff watched through the glass, frozen in their own private storms of fear and awe. The air seemed to thicken, every sound sharp and distant at the same time. Helen thought of how her husband used to say every creature wants to go home when it's hurt, and the thought almost broke her. This bear had no home left, and now here it was, stumbling into a schoolyard, trusting nothing and no one, but too tired to keep running. The sirens were right at the edge now, wailing louder, pulling everyone's nerves taut. Helen took one step forward and felt gravel grind under her heel. The bear's ears flicked toward her, eyes glassy but focused, and for a breathless instant, time held still. Damon exhaled, a controlled sound, and tightened his grip. And then the bear lurched, sudden, violent, a surge of wounded strength, straight toward Helen. Its roar was hoarse but powerful enough to shake her bones. Damon's arms snapped upward, the rifle locking on target. Martin shouted her name, pure panic in his voice. Helen froze as the ground quivered beneath the massive creature's charge, her heart pounding with the shocking truth that she might not get another chance to do anything at all. Everything narrowed down to that moment. A dying bear, a trembling woman, a rifle raised in judgment, and a whole town caught in the space between fear and mercy. What happened next would decide everything. The ground trembled under the bear's sudden movement, and Helen's breath caught like a rope tightening around her chest. It wasn't a clean charge, more like a staggering, desperate lunge, a wounded titan using the last of its strength. Damon cursed under his breath, rifle locked on the creature's chest, but his finger hesitated on the trigger as Helen stepped forward instead of back. Her heart slammed so hard she thought she might faint, yet some strange clarity burned through the panic. The bear's massive body dragged itself the last few feet, claws scraping sparks from a buried stone. Its ragged breathing filled the schoolyard, a sound so raw and uneven it felt almost human. Helen's voice broke as she spoke softly to it, not caring who heard her, telling it she saw its pain, that it wasn't alone now. Her hands hovered in the cold air, trembling but steady enough to show she meant no harm. Damon's jaw clenched. Years of training screamed at him to end the threat before it ended someone else. But there was something in Helen's stance that pulled him back, a steel in her eyes that said she wasn't about to let another life be taken. Not like this. Not today. Martin's voice cracked behind them, begging her to move, to think of her own life. But Helen didn't look back. The bear lowered its head and let out a sound that froze everyone in place. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't even a roar. It was low, broken, almost like the whimper of a creature who had run out of fight. Its legs buckled, and it dropped heavily to its side just a few feet from Helen. The impact sent a soft plume of dust into the air. Helen sank to her knees, gravel biting into her skin through her jeans, but she didn't care. She leaned forward, tears stinging her eyes, and whispered again, soft, steady, like a prayer meant to reach beyond pain. The bear's chest rose and fell in jagged rhythm. Its muzzle brushed the dirt, eyes half-lidded, fixed on something far away. Up close, Helen saw old scars tracing its ribs, evidence of traps and bullets and a lifetime of survival. She felt anger and grief collide inside her, her hands trembling inches from its paw. Damon took a cautious step closer, rifle lowered now, his eyes darting between Helen and the creature that looked more like a ghost than a threat. The schoolyard was silent except for the ragged sound of that breathing. Teachers who had been shouting moments ago were now whispering prayers. Martin stepped forward, torn between wanting to pull Helen away and not daring to break the fragile peace that hung between human and beast. Helen's mind spun with fragments of memory. Her husband's laugh, his words about respecting the wild, the way he'd always believed every living thing deserved one last chance. She felt something shift in her chest, like a lock breaking open. Damon finally spoke, voice low, almost reverent. He told her he'd seen bears put down for far less, but this one was different. Helen nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks, never taking her eyes off the massive creature beside her. Then the bear shuddered, its whole body convulsing as if some buried agony had been stirred awake. The fur along its side shifted, and Helen's breath hitched as she saw it. Glinting in the morning light, a jagged piece of rusted metal buried deep near its ribcage, blood seeping around it. Damon swore, stepping closer, eyes narrowing. That wasn't from a bullet. That was something far older, far crueler. The bear's paw twitched, claws scraping helplessly at the earth, and Helen's heart broke all over again. She whispered to it, promising help, promising it wouldn't have to suffer alone anymore. Around them, a fragile hope began to take root. But before anyone could act, a new sound cut through the tension. The distant growl of an engine, growing louder, closer, bringing with it a fresh wave of uncertainty that made everyone's blood run cold. The sound of that engine sliced through the cold air like a blade, pulling every head toward the distant road. But before anyone could react, Damon crouched low beside the bear, eyes narrowing as he studied the twisted shard protruding from the torn fur. He muttered under his breath, words sharp with anger. This wasn't a clean bullet wound at all. It was the rusted jaw of a steel trap, still embedded in the flesh, the kind outlaw trappers used decades ago and left to rot in the woods. Helen's breath caught as she saw the jagged edges and the skin swollen and inflamed around it. Her fingers curled into fists. She didn't know whose hands had set such a thing, but she felt a surge of fury that surprised her. This animal hadn't just stumbled into danger. It had been fighting a slow war long before it bled onto this playground. The bear stirred weakly, one paw scraping at the swing chain, setting off a rhythmic creak that filled the silence like a haunting lullaby. Martin stepped closer, unable to mask the awe in his voice, as he whispered that no living thing should have to endure this. A teacher in the doorway clasped her hands over her mouth, eyes brimming with tears. For a few breaths, everyone simply stood there, caught between horror and heartbreak, realizing they were looking at suffering they couldn't ignore. Helen crouched lower, speaking softly again, telling the bear it wasn't alone anymore. Damon unclipped his radio, voice steady but charged with urgency, calling for a wildlife medic and equipment, not weapons. His tone left no room for debate. He didn't care about protocol or paperwork. He wanted help, fast. Martin knelt beside Helen, his usual calm cracking. He admitted, almost in disbelief, that he'd spent years teaching about ecosystems and balance, but he'd never felt the weight of it until now. The bear groaned, a deep, tired sound that pulled at every heart within earshot. For a fleeting second, Helen laughed bitterly through her tears, shaking her head at the absurdity of it. An old bear on a schoolyard, breaking hearts and turning rules upside down. Damon set the rifle down, eyes locked on the horizon as the engine noise grew louder. The rumble had an edge to it now, fast and reckless. Dust kicked up on the far road, a black pickup tearing toward the fence. A figure leaned out of the window, sunlight flashing off the barrel of a rifle. Damon's stomach tightened. He knew that kind of entrance. This wasn't help. This was trouble. Helen didn't move, one hand hovering over the bear's paw like she could shield it with nothing but her will. Martin rose, scanning the staff huddled behind the glass. He told them to stay back, his voice low but commanding. The creak of that swing chain continued, a sound that felt almost like a heartbeat counting down. The truck roared closer, brakes screaming as it fishtailed near the gate. Gravel spat into the air, and the engine growled to a stop. A tall man in a battered jacket jumped out, his face weathered, his jaw tight with rage. He didn't hesitate. He shouldered the rifle and strode forward, shouting words that made Helen's blood run cold. That bear doesn't belong here. That bear should have been dead days ago. Damon took 2 quick steps toward him, hand raised, his other hovering near his holster. He shouted back, his voice steady but sharp, telling the man to lower the weapon, to step away, that the situation was under control. The man didn't even blink, eyes locked on the wounded Grizzly, jaw clenched with a hatred that seemed years deep. Helen rose slowly, positioning herself between the stranger and the bear, her legs trembling but her voice strong. She told him this animal had done enough suffering, that it wasn't a monster, that mercy mattered more than whatever score he thought he was settling. The man's laugh was bitter and jagged, his words spilling out about livestock ripped apart, neighbors' lives scarred by predators. His anger filled the air like a storm rolling in. Martin moved to stand beside Helen, shoulders squared, though his hands shook. Damon barked one last warning, but the man tightened his grip on the rifle, steps crunching closer to the fallen Grizzly. The bear, stirred by the shouting, lifted its head weakly, dark eyes meeting the man's. For a split second, the yard went silent, the air thick with a question no one dared to answer. The man's jaw flexed, his finger tightening on the trigger, and in that heartbeat Helen felt the entire world teeter, between compassion and cruelty, between mercy and bloodshed. The bear let out a sound so low and mournful that it froze everyone in place, a sound that felt less like a threat and more like a plea. And in that breathless moment, no one knew which way this fragile, heartbreaking standoff would break. The air was razor-thin, almost humming with tension, as that rifle stayed locked in the stranger's hands. Damon's voice cut through the yard again, low and deliberate, telling him he didn't want to do this. Not here, not now. But the man's jaw set tighter, a storm of fury and grief burning behind his eyes. He took another step closer, boots crunching the gravel like slow thunder. Helen held her ground, every heartbeat hammering against her ribs. She could feel the eyes of the staff behind the glass, the quiet gasps, the fear hanging on every breath. The man's knuckles whitened around the rifle as he spat out words that felt like old wounds ripped open. He told them his brother had been mauled on these very hills, that he'd buried livestock and watched neighbors weep over torn pastures. He said predators don't change. They only wait. For a moment, Helen almost staggered under the weight of his pain. She understood what loss could do, how it could hollow you out and fill the spaces with anger sharp enough to cut through reason. But standing there, between a dying bear and a man shaking with vengeance, she also understood something else. Suffering didn't need more suffering to be redeemed. Her voice trembled but didn't falter. She told him that hatred had already cost him enough, that this creature wasn't the one who'd taken his brother, that carrying rage had only kept him chained to the worst day of his life. The man flinched at that, eyes darting away for the briefest second. Damon seized on it, stepping in closer, reminding him that this was no hunt, that law or no law, firing that weapon here would end badly, for everyone. Martin joined them now, his usual calm unraveling into urgency. His voice rough as he told the man that children would be arriving soon, that blood on this yard would stain more than the soil. The bear stirred again, a low groan rolling out of its chest, heavy and mournful, and that sound cut through the man's anger like a blade through rope. He faltered, lowering the rifle an inch, his breath coming fast and uneven. Helen saw it, that tiny fracture in his armor, and pushed with everything she had left. She told him she had lost someone too, that grief had nearly eaten her alive, and that standing here now she could see how choosing mercy had been the only thing that had ever saved her. His shoulders trembled. For the first time, his eyes softened, darting back to the bear, then to the ground. His fingers loosened on the trigger, the weight of years collapsing in his posture. He dropped to one knee, not out of surrender but out of exhaustion, muttering words no one else caught. And then, with a rasped exhale, he lowered the rifle entirely, tossing it into the truck bed with a hollow clang that echoed through the yard. The silence that followed was deafening. Damon's grip on his own weapon loosened as he motioned to his deputies to stand down. Martin's chest rose with a shaky breath, relief flooding his lined face. Helen felt her legs finally tremble beneath her, but she didn't move, eyes still locked on the Grizzly. The bear's breathing was shallow now, each rise of its chest slower, weaker, as though the fight was slipping out of it inch by inch. The man stayed by his truck, shoulders slumped, hands hanging uselessly by his sides, the fire in his eyes dimmed to a weary gray. And in the middle of that schoolyard, with gravel and dust swirling lightly in the cold air, Helen knelt back down beside the wounded giant. Her fingertips brushed its matted fur, and her heart clenched as she felt the tremor in its body, the life flickering like a candle guttering against the wind. No one spoke. No one moved. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to hold still, watching, waiting, as sirens wailed closer and closer down the road. And then, just as that distant help came within reach, the bear's eyes fluttered, its breath hitched, and something in Helen's chest told her they might be running out of time. The sirens cut through the crisp air like an electric current, growing louder as the dust of the last standoff began to settle. Helen stayed kneeling beside the bear, her knees numb on the cold gravel, her hand hovering over its fur as if afraid that even the lightest touch might break whatever fragile thread held its life in place. Around her, no one moved. It was as if the schoolyard itself had become holy ground, each breath held, each heartbeat sharp with expectation. Then the bear's chest heaved, a sudden rasping breath tearing free, and a sound rolled out of its throat that stopped time. It was not rage. It was not defiance. It was something ancient, raw, heartbreak stitched into a single haunting note. The sound made Martin's hands clench at his sides. It made Damon's eyes flicker, the old sheriff's mask cracking as he swallowed hard. Even the man from the hills, still standing by his truck, looked down and dragged a hand over his face like he couldn't bear the weight of what he was feeling. Helen's own breath came fast, uneven. That sound was telling her something. She could feel it deep in her ribs. It was a plea, a confession, a reminder that pain didn't belong only to humans. She leaned closer, her voice trembling as she whispered to the bear again, telling it not to give up, not now, not when help was finally on its way. The roar still lingered in the air like a ghost, rattling through every corner of the yard. A teacher watching through the window wiped at her eyes, shaking her head as if trying to understand why this moment felt bigger than all of them. Damon turned to the man from the hills, his voice low but urgent, telling him this wasn't just an animal. This was a survivor. The man gave no answer, but his jaw loosened, his fists unclenching as he stared at the ground. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder. 2 white trucks skidded to a stop just outside the gate, and a team of wildlife rescuers spilled out, carrying cases and stretchers, their faces taut with focus. Damon signaled them in, explaining in quick bursts about the injury, about the metal lodged deep in the creature's side. Helen rose unsteadily, brushing dirt from her hands, but her eyes never left the bear. The rescuers moved fast, setting equipment down, speaking in clipped tones. They carried sedatives, bandages, clamps. One knelt beside the bear, muttering about the damage, how long it might have been running, how it was a miracle it made it this far. Helen stepped back just enough to give them room but stayed close enough that the bear could still sense her presence. She wanted it to know she hadn't left. And then the bear shifted again, its eyes opening just enough to catch hers. There was something there, something beyond instinct, beyond fear. A silent recognition that twisted her heart so hard she felt tears break free. She knelt again without thinking, her voice breaking as she promised it that whatever happened next, it wouldn't be alone. The rescuers worked quickly, slipping a line into place, preparing to lift it. Damon stepped back, rubbing at his face, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. Martin turned to look at the horizon, his chest rising with a shaky sigh, and the man from the hills remained by his truck, shoulders slumped as if something inside him had finally let go. Then the bear's chest rattled with another deep breath, but this one sounded different, thin, strained, as though the fight was flickering out. Helen froze, panic rising as she whispered again, desperate, urging it to stay. The lead rescuer shook his head slightly, hands moving faster now, trying to stabilize the creature. The sirens had stopped, but the only sound left was the strained rhythm of a life clinging to its last seconds. And just as the stretcher was slid under its massive body, the bear's head dipped, its eyes fluttered shut, and Helen felt the world tilt, every ounce of hope tightening in her chest as she waited, terrified, to see if that final breath would come back again. The rescuers worked in a blur, hands darting, tools clinking, voices hushed but urgent. Helen stayed on her knees beside the bear, her own breath coming in short, shallow bursts. She kept speaking to it softly, not even aware of the words anymore, just letting her voice carry the ache and hope tangled inside her. Damon hovered a few feet away, one hand pressed against his forehead, as if willing himself to stay steady, to stay strong. The team injected a sedative meant to ease the pain, to calm the spasms tearing through its body. One of them murmured about blood loss, about the hours it must have been running wounded through the forest, about how incredible it was that it had survived long enough to reach them at all. Martin crouched near the fence, gripping the wire so tight his knuckles turned white. He whispered something to himself, maybe a prayer, maybe just the desperate repetition of the same thought over and over. Don't die, don't die, don't die. The bear's breathing slowed, the rise and fall of its massive chest becoming shallow, uneven. Helen's tears streamed freely now, dripping onto the matted fur. She told it she was sorry for every hurt it had endured, sorry for every trap and bullet and cruel hand that had marked its life. She thanked it for trusting her, even for just these few minutes in a world that had given it nothing but reasons to run. One of the rescuers met Damon's eyes and gave the smallest shake of his head. Damon looked down, his throat working as he swallowed hard, unable to speak. Martin turned his face away, hiding the tears that burned in his own eyes. Even the man from the hills stepped forward, slow and hesitant, as if each step was heavier than the last. He knelt opposite Helen, his weather-beaten hand hovering above the bear's shoulder before finally resting there. His voice cracked as he admitted he hadn't seen it this way before, that he'd only ever seen the damage, never the suffering. Helen looked at him through her tears and managed a broken smile. She told him it wasn't too late to see differently, that even a life full of rage could still find mercy in the end. His eyes glistened as he nodded, the rifle now forgotten in the truck bed behind him. The bear let out one final sigh, a sound so soft and deep it seemed to sink into the earth itself. Its massive body stilled, the tremors fading, the fight gone. Helen's hand stayed on its fur, unwilling to move, unwilling to let go of the connection they'd forged in those fleeting, impossible minutes. Silence fell over the schoolyard. No one spoke. No one needed to. The swing chains swayed gently in the breeze, their creak the only sound that dared to break the moment. Damon removed his hat, pressing it to his chest. Martin wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, eyes fixed on the ground. And the man from the hills closed his eyes, bowing his head, a lifetime of anger folding into something softer, something that might even be peace. Helen stayed there longest, fingers still buried in the thick fur, heart aching but also strangely full. This bear had walked into their lives broken and bleeding, and somehow, in its final moments, it had reminded them all of something rare and powerful, that mercy could bloom in the most unlikely places, and that even the wildest heart could leave behind a legacy of grace. When she finally rose, legs trembling, the yard felt changed. Not quieter, not louder, just different. A place marked forever by the memory of a creature who came seeking nothing and gave them everything. And as the rescuers carefully draped a blanket over the still form, Helen looked up at the hills where the morning fog still lingered and whispered a single word to the wind. Home.